That's right. Okay, well, as our upcoming guest is going to point out, in the world of quality management systems, the nature of the relationship between risk management and preventive management is often confused and misunderstood. It's often thought that simply going through the risk assessment process means that you won't need to do preventive action. And that isn't true, says Hermann Ries, author of Risk Assessment and the Quality Management System, which appeared in this week's Quality Digest Daily. Hermann is with us on the show today to talk a little bit about about risk and preventive action and what they mean to each other. Hi, Hermann. How are you?
Hello. How are you? Glad to be here.
Oh, good. Okay, so you say in your article that risk management does not eliminate preventive action and that, in fact, they're sequential. What do you mean by that, and can you give us an example, maybe?
Sure. Usually what happens when I'm auditing is I ask for examples of preventive action, and I get a headlights look. And I think that is because the interpretation of preventive action as being the prime element of the standard is wrong. The preventive action is a follow-up to risk assessment. You have to find out what you're trying to prevent, and then you can go ahead and see what preventive action you're going to take and then see what impact it has. But risk assessment is the input into preventive action, so it is sequential. You can't have preventive action without understanding what the risks are that you're trying to prevent.
And have you, without naming companies obviously, can you give us an example maybe of something that you've seen, something out in the field where you do a risk assessment, you spot something, and then that leads to a type of preventive action? Is there something you might be able to share?
Well, yeah, it could be something that perhaps during obviously a follow-up to a corrective action, if something went wrong, you're basically looking at a preventive action to prevent that root cause from happening again. However, that root cause is really where the risk assessment comes in. So when you take a look at, let's say there's a product that came back from a customer, and now you want to take a look at what really happened here. The deep dive here is really the looking at caused that product to go bad, and was it people, was it documents, was it the process, was it whatever it was. And then you can actually have a defined preventive action to know exactly, yeah, that should really fix it. Now, if something never happened in the first place, such as a preventive action by itself, then you take a look at the risk, but you don't know if what you're going to do is going to fix it because it didn't happen in the first place. So the risk, the definition of the risk itself becomes extremely important because you need to know exactly what you're trying to fix, and that gives you the exact steps on how to approach that.
Okay, you said something there that kind of caught my ear. You mentioned you mentioned documentation. The problem might be in documentation. In your article, you say that I believe you say that all of the elements described in an ISO 9001 compliant QMS can benefit from risk assessment, and you mentioned documentation, management review, training, and so forth. But one that actually kind of seemed a little unexpected for me was a risk analysis of your documentation, and you just mentioned that. What do you mean by that? I mean, what kind of risks might your documentation pose?
Well, the documentation these days is no longer the paper document that we're really talking about. I would say 85–90% of documentation is online. So when a company has a global operation, then very often the documentation is dependent on a localization for various parts of the world, wherever it is being used. And so the documentation itself needs to be extremely specific as to what it is trying to do. What is the expected result of this documentation? What do we want to see in the use of this document? And that is really the risk assessment. Can this be misinterpreted? Is the documentation really exact enough to give the desired result? And if it is not, then that is the risk that needs to be examined. What is the wording? What is the follow-through? What is the expected result when we use this documentation?
So what you're saying is that if the documentation itself isn't precise enough, or maybe even has a mistake, it can cause, the documentation itself can lead to negative consequences.
That is exactly it. And I think that is something that has to be done by trial and error before it gets put into actual practice. So you do have a new document that is being revised, or you have something that you're posting on the web, then you have to take a look. Can we try this out? Can we check this out? And not just post it because it was somebody's great idea. I mean, that's the risk, is that it's some local idea that may be very good for that particular site, but it doesn't apply to other sites. And so the implementation could lead to larger problems. So the risk assessment is really in the completion of the documentation. Is it really comprehensive enough for everyone to understand with the details that people need?
Herman, one problem that you point out with risk analysis of a quality management system is that when preventive actions are based on possible but not proven risks are implemented, so the results are often difficult to verify. Maybe you can explain that. It's a little bit of an interesting way to look at it. So maybe you can explain that a little bit more, what you're talking about there.
Sure. When you take a look at a preventive action that is the result of a risk analysis, right now, I mean, when we take a look at what the standard says right now, I don't know what the new standard comes out, but right now, when we're taking a look at that, we're still looking at the effectiveness of what we've done, the effectiveness of the preventive action. And that, I think, is what I mentioned earlier, is that when nothing's happened in the first place, how can you say that this preventive action actually did the trick and actually prevented that risk from happening? So a lot of times the preventive action that is stated in result of a risk analysis is kind of vague because we don't really know what we're going to be looking for. I think it is extremely important that the preventive action be clear enough and have precise steps what we want to do, because we need to see what was the impact of what we did. You can't look at the effectiveness of something that happened when you implement it, but when you take a look at what's the possible impact, that is the risk analysis that needs to be done. What could possibly be happening to all the processes? All the processes related, and they have inputs and outputs, so the preventive action of the result of a risk analysis is a process, and it can have an impact on other areas, and that is the impact that needs to be studied.
How important is it, or is it even possible, just kind of keeping in the same vein here, is really being able to understand whether your preventive action is actually even going to work? I mean, is that just one of those things where you correct it on the fly? You do your risk analysis, you come up with a preventive action. Unfortunately, that thing happens, and you put your preventive action in place, and maybe it didn't work. Is there even a way to test for that?
Well, no, there isn't, and that's exactly the point that I'm saying. The quality of the is up front that, of course, determines what your preventive action is going to be. If you know what the expected impact would be, or what could be an impact of the preventive action, then you can already take a look at was it really working or not, or did it create a bigger problem than what we had in the first place? So the risk analysis really is, unless you have the right amount of detail of input from everybody concerned, it can be kind of vague, and therefore the preventive action is stated in the same business, and therefore that lead to, let's say, concrete actions that could actually say, well, we've tried everything that we can think of, and if we do this, the impact is going to be not going to happen, and it's not affecting anything else. So the quality of the risk assessment is the all-important thing, and more people you have involved in that, with all the related processes that might be affected, the better are. The preventive action is only something you're actually going to do and try out and see if it works, but you can't really tell unless you have a desired result.
Well, Herman, we're going to leave it there, but everyone out there who's interested in this topic, and there are many of us who are, can tune in, because we're going to have a webinar, Dirk, that you and Herman are going to be presenting together on July 8th. And you can see it right there, July 8th, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Herman, in your article is a link out to the registration page. All of you out there can follow your email. We'll be having more information about how you can register for that webinar and take a deeper dive on this topic with Dirk and with Herman on July 8th. So, Herman, we'll see you then. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll check in with you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much. We'll see you then.
See you then. Thanks, Herman. Bye. Good stuff. Well, risk. Hey, we talk about risk a lot, and risk and the QMS. A lot of you out there are obviously working in quality management systems and need to understand that. And if you want to understand more, Herman's got a lot to say about it.
That's right.
So make sure
sign up for that webinar.
Tune in for that webinar on July 8th. Okay.